Primitive civilizations, such as the Aboriginals of Australia, were also those of the Native Americans. Until about 700 years ago, the existence of the inhabitants of these continents was completely unknown to the already developed civilizations of the other three continents. Isolated from any external communication, they continued their historical course in a parallel cultural and musical universe. But what happened and these universes finally met? At the end of the 15th century begins the period of search of Western European powers for new territories, the so-called colonial times, in order to increase their prestige and domination. This will be done through the big seafarers who through transatlantic sea voyages will add to human history one of its most crucial points, the discovery of the new countries. In 1520, the Portuguese seafarer Ferdinand Magellan, shortly after sailing in the Gulf of Rio de Janeiro, will discover the Gulf of Rio de la Plata. Imagine that Magellan and his Spanish crew heard from a distance a ceremony of the natives of the area, where they played the following organic melody. What would the reactions to this cultural encounter be from both sides? On the one hand, we had a captain and crew who arrived from a society that at that time was experiencing the first stages of the European Renaissance. Most likely they knew about the great scientific discoveries and inventions of a special personality, Leonardo da Vinci. Also, Magellan had knowledge of the ancient Greek philosophy and literature that were then returning to Western Europe. As for the music sector, they were listening to the monophonic ecclesiastical Gregorian chant, while the French composer, with a long stay in Italy, Philippe Verdelot, is preparing his first scores that will establish him as the founder of madrigal's polyphonic form. These people, coming from a society of advanced science with compasses and maps, arriving with their huge ships and some of them dressed in impressive and imposing clothes and accessories, meet a culture that about 700 years back today lived in absolute harmony with nature. They were also elements of nature and the natural landscape that lived as an organized human society, with their own rules, their own hierarchy, their own symbolism, their own language, their own songs, and their own music. There was a big cultural gap in this meeting. But how did this meeting develop, which was led to a type of cohabitation? And most importantly, what were the results of this mixing in the field of music? What happened there after Magellan crossed the future Buenos Aires? In general, the colonial policy of the Spaniards, in combination with the Portuguese, prevailed in South America. There were many distinct indigenous people throughout America, later renamed by Christopher Columbus from the general nickname Indians. Despite the differences that can be observed between these groups, considering the size of this continent and the different geographical and climatic conditions, we can identify some common cultural elements that govern all the then Indians. Their main common feature was that they remained in the form of a primitive civilization until the beginning of the 16th century. Let's listen to an excerpt from a lament of the Tierra del Fuego in southern Argentina on a 1966 recording. We listened to Lola Kiepia at the age of 90, the oldest of the last 10 Selknam people alive in 1966, a tribe of Indians living on the largest island of Tierra del Fuego. Kiepia, who was also the last shaman of her tribe, was singing in her native Indian language, in which she preferred to speak until the end of her life. She could barely communicate in Spanish, as she was never assimilated by the dominant Spanish culture of Argentina, as was often the case. Selknam's music had no musical instruments, so it relied solely on the use of voice. As for the harmonious framework of the lament, the intense use of the pentatonic scales or parts of them is verified, as in this case, where we have the trichord Fa, Sol and Si, Sol being the tonal center, Fa for short endings, and Si mainly for decompression and adornment. That is a tone and a two-tone interval. Is it worth pondering the question, why did Selknams have no instruments, while certainly even in the last decades of the tribe's existence, they had been in contact with instruments of neighboring musical cultures? Kiepia's lament is a virgin and highly representative example of the musical culture of Native Americans before the colonialism of Western Europe and the advent of aspiring seafarers. In addition to the seafarers, their crew and their necessary army to conquer the American continent and have absolute power over the natives follows a long course of colonization of the American continent. This settlement in the first phase happens with citizens of the colonial countries. As a result, the Spanish speaking of the Spanish conquerors began to infiltrate and gradually dominate present-day Argentina. But what is really starting to happen in the music of the Indians?